Hello, dear listener. Tonight, we'll journey far back in time, to the ancient lands of India. Imagine a world of fragrant herbs, quiet courtyards, and learned healers who moved with a calm, measured grace. In times when illness swept through villages and towns, these Ayurvedic practitioners believed that health was not just the absence of disease, but a balance of the body, mind, and spirit. Over the next chapters, I'll share with you the gentle rituals and thoughtful remedies that these healers practiced. Let this story be a peaceful companion as you drift into rest. The gentle rituals of Ayurvedic healers during epidemics in ancient India. Chapter 1. The Courtyard of Healing. Here is Chapter 1. In the western reaches of the ancient Maurya Empire, where the monsoon winds brought both renewal and ruin, there stood a modest house of healing. It was built of sun-baked bricks, its walls lined with shelves of clay jars and woven baskets filled with leaves, seeds, and powders. The courtyard at its center was shaded by a neem tree, whose broad canopy cast shifting patterns across the stone floor. Beneath its branches, the healer known as Vaidya Raghava began each morning by lighting a small clay lamp. He believed that flame, as a symbol of life, should greet the dawn before any other task. In these years, some 2 millennia ago, epidemics arrived not with warning proclamations, but with the quiet dread that crept from house to house. A cough here, a fever there, until the local well stood silent and children were kept inside. When illness was first reported in the neighboring villages, Raghava prepared in the same way he always had, with methodical calm. He walked the rows of clay jars, checking each for freshness, the powders of turmeric, the dried roots of ashwagandha, the slender sticks of licorice bark. Each would have its part to play. Before dawn had fully brightened the sky, patients began to arrive. Some came in palanquins carried by relatives, wrapped in damp cloths to cool their fevered bodies. Others walked with slow determination, leaning on their children's arms. All carried the same hope, that something in this courtyard, some combination of plant and prayer, might ease their suffering. If they wept, they sang hymns to the plant, as the last hope, supplied by their families, might ease their suffering. The same concept as before, but now they sought in the name of care, not complication. But something in this courtyard, some combination of plant and prayer, might ease their suffering. Raghava never greeted them in haste. He believed that the healer's first medicine was attention itself. One by one, he asked their names, their ailments, how long the sickness had been present. His voice was low and steady, as though it might slow the fever itself. In the early hours, he and his apprentices prepared cleansing infusions. Water drawn from a deep well was boiled with neem leaves, coriander seeds, and a pinch of rock salt. Each pot released a clean, grassy scent. As it cooled, Raghava would dip a strip of cotton into the liquid and gently bathe each patient's hands and face. This act, so simple, was more than sanitation. In the Ayurvedic tradition, it marked the first gesture of purification, a signal to the patient that their body was worthy of care, however frail. In the afternoons, when the air grew heavy with heat, Raghava instructed his apprentices to sweep the courtyard and sprinkle water on the stones, releasing a cooling vapor. The patients rested on reed mats, shaded by woven screens, while the healer prepared medicinal pastes. Each preparation followed centuries of tradition. A paste of sandalwood and rosewater for cooling, a decoction of tulsi and licorice to ease cough, a poultice of turmeric and ginger to soothe aching joints. Even in an epidemic, Raghava never rushed the process. He believed the plants yielded their virtue only to patient hands. While the apprentices worked, the healer walked among the resting sick, offering spoonfuls of warm rice water. He listened to their breathing, he observed the color of their tongues and the clarity of their eyes. He noted each sign in a palm leaf ledger, a living record of the epidemic's course. When dusk fell, and the neem branches stretched their shadows across the courtyard, Raghava returned to the lamp he had lit at dawn. He refilled its oil, trimmed its wick, and whispered a short prayer to Dhanvantari, the divine physician. The flame flickered, but did not waver. That night, as the patient slept beneath thin cotton sheets, the healer sat nearby, grinding fresh herbs for the morning. He believed that vigilance, like any medicine, worked best when it was constant. This was the first day in the long season of illness, a season that would test not only the endurance of the body, but the resilience of compassion itself. Chapter 2. The Arrival of the Monsoon. In the days that followed, the sky itself seemed to grow heavy with forewarning. The air turned thick and metallic, carrying the scent of wet earth even before the first drops fell. Merchants in the town markets packed their goods beneath oiled cloths, and children were called indoors. It was the season when fevers multiplied in every stagnant pool, and when the courage of healers was most quietly tested. Vaidya rose before dawn on the second day, as was his custom, to prepare the courtyard. He knew the monsoon rains were more than a backdrop to illness. They were a force that shaped every remedy. In dry months, he used warming tonics and pungent oils to stoke the body's fire. But in the damp season, it was coolness and drying herbs that the humors required. He moved along the low shelves, selecting small pouches tied with twine. Inside lay powders of nutgrass and myrobalan, bitter and astringent, to draw out excess moisture from the body. He set these aside and prepared thin wicks for the lamps, knowing they would be needed through long nights when the sick could not sleep. By the time the first patients appeared, the sky was already a dull pewter. A hush fell over the courtyard as neighbors arrived, leading their loved ones with quiet urgency. A mother carried her daughter, no more than 5, whose limbs were limp against her shoulder. An elderly farmer, his skin the color of dry teak, shuffled in with a hacking cough that shook his whole frame. Raghava greeted each without alarm. He motioned them to the reed mats, and his apprentices brought warm water infused with cloves and ginger. Though the girl could not swallow, he wet a strip of linen and pressed it gently against her lips so that some trace of the herbs might ease her throat. When the first thunder rumbled, the healer looked up at the neem branches, their leaves trembling in anticipation. The rain came moments later, a sudden, unstoppable curtain. The apprentices scrambled to lower the bamboo blinds and cover the medicine jars with cloth. For a few moments, the courtyard became an island, hemmed in by the roar of water, yet within that space, all remained ordered. Raghava instructed his apprentices to set out shallow clay dishes filled with camphor and burning embers. The rising fragrance, sharp and clean, served 2 purposes: to ease the breath of the sick and to drive away the insects that bred in every puddle. As the rain poured, he turned his attention to the young girl. Her mother, trembling, kept her eyes fixed on the child's chest as it rose and fell in shallow gasps. With measured care, Raghava placed his palm against her forehead. He closed his eyes, feeling the fever's heat radiate into his own skin. At last he spoke in a voice just above a whisper. "Her strength is not gone," he said, "but she will need help to hold it." He prepared a poultice of sandalwood, ground into a cool paste, and spread over a folded cloth. This he laid across the girl's brow, replacing it each time the heat soaked through. Between applications, he dribbled a few drops of honey and ginger infusion into her mouth. The hours passed slowly. Outside, the streets churned with runoff, carrying leaves and petals into the gutters. The rain showed no sign of easing, yet within the courtyard, the rhythm of care remained steady. When the girl stirred at last, her eyelids flickering open, her mother pressed her face to the child's hand, her relief too deep for words. In the afternoon lull, Raghava stepped briefly beneath the eaves to look out at the flooded alley. He knew that in the coming days, more patients would arrive. Some carried from distant villages, where the monsoon's damp had awakened every latent sickness. The knowledge did not trouble him, He had long ago accepted that a healer's work was endless. He returned to the main room where his apprentices were preparing fresh decoctions. One measured a blend of licorice and dry ginger for the older man with the cough. Another arranged bundles of neem twigs, ready to be burned as fumigation when night came. Raghava paused to check the ledgers, recording the day's names and symptoms. His script was careful, each line a quiet testament to the lives that had passed through his hands. He believed that the record mattered, not only for knowledge but for remembrance, that each suffering deserved to be acknowledged. When dusk arrived, the rains eased at last into a softer drizzle. Fireflies flickered among the wet leaves. The patients dozed beneath clean clothes, their breathing easier now. At the far edge of the courtyard, the young girl slept, her fever breaking. Her mother remained awake, watching the lamplight play across her child's face. Raghava moved quietly to her side and laid a folded blanket across her shoulders. No words passed between them, but in that moment, the healer knew that hope had returned to the mother's heart. As night settled over the house of healing, the neem branches dripped steadily and the last embers of camphor smoke curled into the dark. Raghava sat beside the ledgers, grinding more sandalwood paste for the dawn. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new arrivals, and perhaps new griefs. Yet he met that prospect as he had met every season of sickness, with the same patient rituals, the same calm faith that every act of care was worth the effort. On the flight back to New York, he started reading through the books of Surgeon C.F. Chapter 3, The Herb Gatherer's Journey. With the monsoon settling in, the supply of herbs that Vaidya Raghava depended upon began to dwindle. Each day, the jars along the shelves emptied a little more. What had once seemed abundant, bundles of tulsi, baskets of amalaki fruit, coils of fragrant vetiver, now threatened to run out before the rains were done. So on the fourth dawn of the fever season, Raghava called his two most trusted apprentices, Devika and Pranav, and gave them a list written on palm leaf. It was a humble tally, but each item was essential. Without fresh roots and leaves, the remedies would lose their strength. "You must go today," he told them as they tied their cloaks across their shoulders. "Be patient with the mud, and take care that none of the bundles grows damp. Mold will ruin them faster than any insect." As they rode down the street, they saw two messenger horses who wear simple black wrappings. They gently coaxed the horses out, but they were too busy with their work to take them on. They saw too many deaths and mortgages of damp. They walked away from the sea. They found a neighboring town and dined there. They bought and fed. They took care of the poor. They would do whatever they could, and they felt as if they had to. They nodded solemnly. In the apprenticeship of Ayurveda, it was as much a rite of passage to gather herbs as to mix them. Even a healer's knowledge began in the fields and forests. They set out as the first light touched the flooded paths. The roads were almost empty. Only the occasional bullock cart trundled past, carrying sacks of rice husks or bundles of firewood. The air smelled of wet earth and jasmine shaken loose by the rains. Their destination lay several miles beyond the town's edge, where a grove of neem and banyan trees bordered the foothills. Beneath their canopy, the soil stayed cool even in the dampest weather. Many of the most potent herbs, haritaki, breenraj, brahmi, thrived there. The journey was slow. The monsoon had turned every hollow in the road into a shallow pond. Devika, whose frame was slight, sometimes sank to her ankles in clay-rich mud. Each time she stumbled, she rose again without complaint. Pranav carried the baskets and kept careful watch for scorpions sheltering beneath the larger leaves. By mid-morning, they reached the edge of the grove. There, the hush of the forest seemed to swallow the patter of rain. Moisture dripped steadily from leaf to leaf. Small rivulets traced patterns in the moss. They paused to offer a silent prayer of gratitude to the plants themselves. a ritual Raghava had taught them. In Ayurveda, no leaf was taken without acknowledgement. Each harvest was a partnership between healer and earth. Moving in measured steps, they began their work. Pranav bent to gather the lower stems of Brahmi, bright green against the rich soil. Devika climbed a flat rock to reach a cluster of amalaki fruit, small, pale spheres heavy with bitter potency. She twisted each from its stem and placed it carefully in a dry cloth. Hours passed unnoticed. The grove's quiet was a world apart from the fretful murmurs of the sick. Here, everything moved according to older rhythms. When their baskets were nearly full, they sat beneath a banyan tree to share a meal of flattened rice and jaggery wrapped in banana leaf. They spoke little, but their hearts felt steadier than they had in days. To touch the living plants reminded them that renewal was always close, even when fever seemed unstoppable. When people live in the unknown. On the return journey, the rain resumed in earnest. The narrow path turned slick, but they protected their harvest with layers of oiled cloth. Each step took effort, yet neither apprentice complained. They knew the weight they carried was measured not only in pounds, but in hope. By dusk, they reached the courtyard again. Raghava was waiting near the neem tree, a lamp already lit against the gathering dark. When he saw the bundles, he gave a rare, unguarded smile. "Set them here," he said, motioning to a long wooden table. "We will sort them before night." Carefully, they unwrapped each parcel. The air filled with the mingled scents of a dozen herbs, sharp, earthy, bitter, clean. Raghava checked each for damage, his fingers probing the leaves for signs of mold. All were sound. "You have done well," he said quietly. "These will help many." They worked by lamplight, arranging the harvest in small heaps. Some would be dried and ground into powders. Others would be infused into decoctions or blended into pastes. Even the bits too small for medicine would be burned in the fire pits to cleanse the air. Nothing would be wasted. As the final bundles were laid out, Raghava poured warm water scented with vetiver and offered it to the apprentices. In the paste, the people ate until the tables turned warm. As the apprentice, Devika felt the ache in her legs, but it was a satisfying pain, proof that the day's effort had been worthy. Beyond the courtyard walls, the rains fell in steady sheets, obscuring every path and rooftop. Yet within, there was order and purpose. The jars along the shelves would be refilled. The ledgers would continue to record each remedy and each recovery. Raghava looked at the gathered herbs, then at the faces of his apprentices. In that moment, he felt the quiet conviction that no season of sickness, however fierce, could outlast the steady work of many hands. He dipped his head in gratitude, first to them, then to the unseen forces that guided all healers, and extinguished the lamp. The night was long, but the house of healing was ready. Chapter 4. The Ritual of Fumigation. The rains did not relent. By the 5th day of the fever season, the alleys around the house of healing had become narrow canals. Neighbors waded through knee-deep water to deliver baskets of rice or bring word of new illness. Within the courtyard, every surface glistened with dampness, and the air itself felt thick enough to drink. It was in such weather that fevers multiplied fastest. Raghava knew this well. So he turned his attention to a ritual older than any written text, the fumigation of the sick room. Long before Ayurveda was set down on palm leaf, healers had learned that fragrant smoke could drive away the unseen causes of disease. Even if they did not know the names of the smallest creatures that bred in stagnant pools, they understood that purification was more than a metaphor. After dawn prayers, he called Pranav and Devika to prepare the ingredients. First came the dry twigs of neem, piled into a wide bronze basin. Then a measure of resinous frankincense, prized for its cleansing scent. Next, slender sticks of sandalwood, their pale grain fragrant even before flame touched them. Finally, he added a small handful of dried herbs, tulsi for protection, vetiver for coolness, and a pinch of camphor to sharpen the breath. Each was laid with care, as though building an offering. Fumigation is not a thing to be rushed, he reminded them. The smoke must rise gently and fill every corner. They carried the basin to the center of the courtyard. Raghava struck flint against steel, and the first sparks leapt into the dry twigs. A moment later, a curl of pale smoke unfurled itself into the humid air. As the fire took hold, the scent deepened. Earthy, resinous, slightly sweet, it mingled with the monsoon damp in a way that felt almost ceremonial. One by one, the patients were led to low stools near the basin. The smoke coiled around them, touching their hair and skin. Some coughed softly at first, unused to the sharpness of the camphor. But soon their breathing eased. Raghava passed among them with a fan of woven palm leaf, guiding the smoke toward each waiting face. In Ayurveda, this was called dupana, the ritual of smoke. It was not only a treatment, but a sign that no one would be left to battle illness alone. As the sun rose higher, the smoke drifted in slow waves through every doorway and lattice screen. It slipped into corners where dampness lingered. It wound itself around the ledgers, the bundles of herbs, the mats where the sick lay resting. Even when the basin's fire burned low, the scent remained, an invisible promise that this place was consecrated to care. At midday, Raghava prepared a second, smaller fumigation for the inner room, where the youngest patients slept. Here, the air was heavier, and the smell of stale fever clung to every cloth. He lit a new fire, this time adding pieces of dry turmeric root and a fragment of guggul resin. The smoke this blend produced was thicker, almost golden in color. As it rose, he recited a simple verse, invoking the presence of Dhanvantari. May this smoke carry away all that causes harm. May it clear the path for healing to enter. He did not speak the words for the patient's benefit alone. In the heart of the monsoon, when the rain showed no sign of ending, even the healer needed reminders of purpose. While the smoke worked, Devika moved among the patients with warm cloths, wiping their foreheads. Pranab prepared small doses of ginger and long pepper powder to support their breathing. Together, they moved as though they had practiced the ritual 100 times. And in truth, they had. The epidemics came almost every year, and each season carried its own lessons. Outside, the rain deepened into a steady roar. It hammered the neem branches, flooded the gutters, and filled every dip in the road. Yet within the courtyard, the air felt different, purified, lighter, almost expectant. In the afternoon, when the fumes had thinned to a memory, Raghava gathered the cold embers into a clay pot. These ashes, he explained to his apprentices, were not to be discarded. They would be mixed into a paste to anoint the thresholds and protect against further contagion. As twilight approached, the patients began to doze, their breathing less labored. Even the smallest gestures, fanning smoke, wiping brows, sprinkling ash, had done their part. Raghava stood at the edge of the courtyard, looking out through the bamboo blinds to the rain-churned street. He knew that many in the town would never see these rituals. To them, the healer's art might seem nothing more than superstition or habit. But he understood that the power of dupana lay not only in the herbs or the smoke itself, but in the intention. One day, each gesture was an affirmation that the sick were still part of the living world, that their suffering had not exiled them from care. Night came quietly. One by one, the lamps were lit, their small flames shining against the damp darkness. The patients lay beneath clean clothes, the scent of sandalwood still clinging to the air. Raghava took up his ledger and recorded each treatment, each name, each sign of improvement. He wrote, slowly, as if inscribing not just a record, but a prayer. When the final lamp was trimmed and the last patient settled, he set aside the palm leaf book. Tomorrow would bring more fevers, more rain, more work, but tonight the house of healing stood wrapped in the faint sweetness of fumigated air, and for a little while at least, the burden of the epidemic felt lighter. Chapter 5. The Physician's Ledger. As the rain carved rivulets into the clay roads and the fever season reached its second week, Raghava's thoughts often returned to the ledger. It was no mere record of names and treatments. In his mind, it was the living memory of every struggle, every recovery, and every loss that had passed beneath the neem tree's shade. Each morning, after the lamps were trimmed and the first decoctions prepared, he would unroll the palm leaf pages. The script, precise and dark, traced the course of sickness across families and neighborhoods. Next to each entry, he noted the pulse, the color of the tongue, the strength of breath, and the presence of fear in the eyes. It was said that a true Vaidya could read these signs as clearly as a merchant read accounts. To the untrained eye, they looked like mere observations, but Raghava knew they were clues to the deeper balance of doshas, the subtle energies whose harmony meant health and whose turmoil brought disease. On this morning, as rain tapped gently on the reed blinds, he paused over the entry of a young potter named Sajan. The boy had come 6 days before, feverish and delirious, unable to keep down even the thinnest gruel. His mother had sat at his side each night, her hands clasped around his wrist as though she might anchor him to life by sheer force of will. Beside the boy's name, Raghava had drawn a small mark, an inverted crescent. It was the sign he used when an illness hung at the edge between worsening and relief. Today, he resolved to see whether the balance had shifted. He set aside the ledger and prepared a blend of amalaki powder and rock sugar, dissolved in warm water to ease thirst and cool the raging heat. When he entered the inner room, he found the boy awake at last. His gaze, though still hollow, held a glimmer of recognition. Carefully, Raghava lifted Sajan's head and brought the cup to his lips. The boy swallowed a sip, then another, before drifting back into uneasy sleep. Outside, the courtyard filled with quiet motion. Devika prepared poultices of turmeric and sandalwood. Pranav ground dried tulsi leaves for incense. Each task was recorded in the ledger as faithfully as any diagnosis. Raghava believed that the act of writing was itself a discipline of attention. A healer who forgot a name, a date, a small change in complexion, was a healer whose remedies would falter. So he sat each night beneath the neem branches, reed pen in hand, and set down every detail. Long ago, his own teacher had impressed this lesson upon him. Memory fails, ink endures. By midday, the rain eased, replaced by a thin, vaporous mist that clung to every surface. It was the sort of dampness that settled in the lungs and made even mild coughs deepen into rattle. Raghava closed the ledger and moved among the resting patients. To each, he spoke their name. He asked how the night had passed. He laid a hand on their forehead or wrist, feeling for the subtle warmth that signaled the turn of fever. Though some were too weak to reply, he believed they still heard the sound of their names. In a season when sickness made many feel invisible, he understood how powerful it was to be seen. That afternoon, a messenger arrived from a distant village, his tunic soaked to the knees. He brought word that a cluster of new cases had appeared beyond the river. The local healer had exhausted his stores of ginger and neem and asked whether Raghava could spare any supplies. Without hesitation, Raghava instructed Pranav to prepare a parcel, dried herbs, a small cask of clarified butter for poultices, and a reed bundle of palm leaf instructions. Even if the remedies were humble, they might be enough to slow the spread of fever. As the parcel was made ready, Raghava returned to the ledger. He added a note in the margin. Provisions sent to Kalyanapur. Fever reported in 6 households. To him, these lines were as necessary as any treatment. They formed a web of knowledge, connecting healer to healer across the plains. When dusk came, the courtyard glowed with lamplight. The rain had resumed, more softly now, tapping on every tile and leaf. Sajan stirred again. His mother looked up, her eyes raw with exhaustion. Raghava knelt beside them and touched the boy's wrist. The pulse was steadier. Slowly, deliberately, he dipped his pen and drew a new mark in the ledger. a small rising crescent, a sign of hope returning. He did not speak aloud the relief that filled his chest. In a healer's life, it was best to hold such feelings close, lest they sour into pride or fade into complacency. But when he rose, he allowed himself a single deep breath, savoring the quiet satisfaction of this small turning point. As night deepened, he walked the length of the courtyard, checking each mat and each lamp. The scent of sandalwood mingled with the clean smell of rain-cooled earth. In the ledger, the day's entries stood complete. Names, symptoms, treatments, and the silent story of a community holding together against unseen enemies. When the last flame was trimmed, Raghava closed the palm leaf pages and set them beside his sleeping mat. Tomorrow, the work would begin again, and he would record it all, line by careful line, as faithfully as any prayer. Chapter 6. The Clay Pot of Remedies. The morning dawned with an unbroken sheet of rain. It fell in rhythmic splashes against the courtyard tiles, streaming from the eaves in clear rivulets. Raghava rose before the light had fully returned, the air so cool and heavy it seemed to press against his skin. In these dampest weeks of the monsoon, he relied most on one unassuming object, a wide clay pot that stood near the neem tree. To the casual visitor, it looked like any other vessel, streaked with years of use. But inside lay a collection of ingredients carefully chosen to withstand the moisture and retain their potency. It was called the Jar of the Seven Remedies, a tradition passed from teacher to pupil for generations. When sudden fevers struck and fresh herbs could not be gathered, these dried preparations provided the first line of defense. That morning, Raghava drew back the cloth cover and peered inside. Each bundle was wrapped in oilskin, labeled in meticulous script: haritaki powder for digestion, neem bark for cleansing, powdered ginger for warming the breath, licorice root for the throat, dried amalaki fruit to cool the blood, tulsi leaves to ease coughs, and a small sealed packet of camphor to clear the senses. He paused over the camphor. In the damp season, it became precious, sharp and clean as mountain air. He resolved to save it for those most in need. The first patient arrived before the sun was fully risen. She was an elderly woman named Gomati, carried on her son's back. Her eyes were half-lidded, her lips pale. The boy lowered her onto a mat, his face stricken. "She has not spoken since the night," he said, voice hoarse, "and she burns as if she were left in the sun." Raghava crouched beside her, feeling the heat at her temples. He could sense how swiftly the fever had taken hold. In the ledger, he marked her pulse, fast and shallow, and noted the gray tinge at the edges of her nails. From the clay pot, he drew out the powdered amalaki. He measured a careful portion into a brass bowl, then added warm water and a little honey. The mixture cooled the blood, eased thirst, and restored a measure of strength. As he worked, the rain increased, pouring off the tiled roof in heavy curtains. The courtyard became an island again, the world beyond blurred and distant. When the decoction was ready, Raghava pressed it to Gomati's lips. A single swallow. Another. Slowly, her breathing deepened. Her son let out a sigh he did not seem to realize he was holding. Next, he prepared a paste of sandalwood and licorice. He spread it across a strip of linen, laying it gently on her brow. Even in sleep, her face eased, the furrow between her brows softening. The apprentices moved quietly behind him, refilling water jars and checking the other patients. Each time a new arrival came, Raghava opened the clay pot, measuring out the powders with the same precision. For a small child with a racking cough, he mixed tulsi and honey to soothe the throat. For an elderly potter unable to eat, he brewed a thin gruel infused with ginger to kindle the digestive fire. In these hours, the clay pot became the heart of the household, unassuming, constant, a vessel of accumulated knowledge that defied the damp and darkness. As the morning turned to afternoon, the rain finally eased to a drifting drizzle. Raghava took that chance to step into the courtyard. He stood beneath the neem branches, breathing in the washed air. Devika joined him, her palms stained with turmeric. "Vaidya," she said softly, "the supplies in the pot are nearly gone." He nodded, unsurprised. The fever season was always a test of preparation. He would need to send Pranav to the hills again, though the roads remained treacherous. Still, he felt no panic. He had learned long ago that fear served no purpose in the healer's work. He returned to Gumati's side. Her breathing was easier, and her skin had lost some of its fiery heat. He touched her wrist, feeling the flutter of her pulse. A little stronger now. In the ledger, he made a careful note. Fever easing. Continue cooling powders and sandalwood poultice. That evening, as dusk deepened into the hush of night, the last of the remedies were measured out. The clay pot, once full to the brim, now held only a few wrapped bundles. Yet each dose had made a difference. A small reprieve for bodies worn thin by fever. Before the lamps were lit, Raghava placed fresh cloth over the pot and rested his hand on its cool rim. He whispered a short blessing, acknowledging all it had given. Even a simple vessel could hold a lineage of care, if treated with respect. As the night rain resumed, he felt the familiar steadiness in his chest. Tomorrow, more remedies would be gathered, more decoctions prepared. The clay pot would be filled again, and as long as it stood in the courtyard, he believed there would always be something left to offer. Chapter 7. The scented oils of protection. On the 7th day since the rains began in earnest, the damp had grown so persistent that even the thick clay walls could no longer keep it at bay. Clothes hung in the courtyard refused to dry, and the reed mats beneath each patient felt cool to the touch. Raghava rose before dawn to check the sick room. Though the air was heavy with moisture, it held the faint sweetness of sandalwood and vetiver, scents from the previous day's fumigation. Yet he knew that in times of epidemic, cleansing the air once was never enough. He decided to prepare the scented protective oils. In the teachings he had received, oils were more than a comfort. They were a shield, sealing the skin from the damp and keeping the vital energies from scattering under the assault of fever. After morning prayers, he called Devika to bring the large brass vessel, used only for oil infusions. Pranav carried a basket of ingredients: dried tulsi leaves, crushed fennel seeds, shreds of vetiver root, camphor crystals, and a small piece of agar wood. They worked in silence. Raghava measured generous scoops of sesame oil into the vessel, then set it over a low flame. As the oil warmed, he began to add the botanicals, one by one. The mixture gave off a perfume that seemed to reach every dark corner of the house. Once the ingredients had steeped long enough, he removed the vessel from the heat. He let the oil cool to the temperature of the body, no more, no less. When it was ready, he carried a shallow bowl into the sick room. One by one, he and Devika dipped soft cloths into the perfumed liquid and began to anoint each patient's limbs. They started with the feet, which, in Ayurvedic understanding, were pathways of many subtle channels, which meant that their processes could start to move slower and slower, painting the skin with a series of minutes. Raghava moved carefully, spreading the warm oil over ankles and calves, feeling the heat of fever yield momentarily to the calm of touch. Some of the patients murmured in their sleep. Others stirred and opened tired eyes. For a few moments, the anxious lines on their faces eased. He was especially watchful of the youngest, a boy of perhaps 5 years, whose cough had worsened in the night. The child's breathing came in shallow gasps. Raghava dipped his fingers into the oil again, then pressed them lightly at the base of the throat. He had seen this simple treatment turn the course of illness many times. In the humid half-light, the ritual unfolded slowly. Between each patient, Raghava cleansed his hands with warm water and a pinch of dried neem leaf. He believed that the healer's touch was only as pure as the intention behind it, and that each anointing should begin afresh. By the time they finished, the courtyard was bright with morning sun. For the first time in many days, the rain had paused long enough to let the eaves dry. Raghava returned the remaining oil to its brass container and set it in the shaded storeroom. There, It would keep its potency for many days, ready to be warmed again whenever the damp crept back into bones and joints. He noticed how quiet the sick room had become. Though no one would call them cured, the patients seemed steadier. Their breathing no longer rasped in the same desperate way. Some had even drifted into untroubled sleep. When the apprentices stepped outside to draw fresh water, Raghava lingered among the mats. He believed that part of healing was presence, the willingness to sit in the hush between suffering and recovery. The midday hours passed in slow tasks. Devika brewed infusions of ginger and long pepper. Pranav cleaned the brass pots and restocked the small jars of dried herbs. In every corner of the house, the scent of the perfumed oil clung gently, a reminder that some protections could be felt as well as seen. Late in the afternoon, a neighbor appeared at the courtyard gate, her sari soaked to the waist. She carried a basket of fresh neem leaves, her offering to help keep illness at bay. Raghava received it with gratitude. Even the smallest contribution wove the community more tightly together. He believed that no healer worked alone, not truly. Each remedy, each treatment, depended on countless unseen hands. That evening, he lit a small oil lamp near the patient's mats. The flame cast long shadows across the walls, flickering over the faces of those who slept. When he finally sat to record the day in the ledger, he paused over the young boy's name. His breathing had grown easier, but the fever remained. Raghava made a careful note. Continue anointing twice daily. Monitor for signs of deeper infection. Setting aside the reed pen, he closed the ledger with a quiet exhale. Tomorrow would bring more labor and more uncertainty. But the memory of this day, the calming scent, the softened coughs, the brief smiles, felt like a small victory. He walked the courtyard one last time before extinguishing the lamps. The night was cool and silent, and as he lay down to rest, the fragrance of tulsi and sandalwood lingered in the air, a reminder that, even in the shadow of an epidemic, gentleness was a power all its own. Chapter 8. The Patient from the Hill Village. At dawn, a new arrival came to the House of Healing. A thin man with hair streaked by early gray, wrapped in a woolen shawl heavy with rain. He had walked all night from a village in the lower hills, where the fever had spread from house to house until no family was untouched. Pranav helped him to a mat near the neem tree. Though the air was cool, sweat shone on his brow. His breathing came in ragged bursts. When he tried to speak, the words dissolved into a hoarse whisper. Raghava crouched beside him, taking in every detail. The tremor in his limbs, the pallor of his nails, the faint, sour smell that rose from his damp clothes. "Your name?" he asked gently. The man swallowed. "Mahadeva," he rasped, then fell back, exhausted. Raghava called for Devika to fetch a warm blanket and a cup of diluted ginger infusion. As they worked, he opened the ledger and made a fresh entry. Mahadeva of Shantipura. Arrived before sunrise. High fever. Weak pulse. He had seen many patients who collapsed at his threshold, but something about this man struck him deeply. Perhaps the silent endurance in his eyes, or the way he clutched the edge of the mat, as though it were the last link to life. While the infusion cooled, Raghava prepared a simple treatment. He chose haritaki powder mixed with a little rock sugar, an ancient combination to ease digestion and support the dwindling strength. He also knew the fever might worsen before it waned, so he ordered a fresh poultice of sandalwood and vetiver to be renewed every few hours. The morning unfolded in quiet purpose. Rain dripped from the eaves in slow, steady patterns. Inside the sick room, the other patients shifted restlessly on their mats, though most were too weak to rise. From time to time, Raghava returned to Mahadeva's side. He did not try to force conversation. Instead, he placed a steady hand on the man's wrist, feeling the faint drumbeat of his pulse. He believed that touch, when offered without urgency, could anchor the sick more surely than words. By midday, Mahadeva managed a few sips of the ginger infusion. His eyes flickered open, dark and sunken, but clearer than before. "You walked far," Raghava said. The man nodded. "No healer. Left in the village. All fell ill or fled. Raghava felt a cold thread unspool down his spine. He had heard rumors of whole households succumbing in the lower hills, but now the proof sat before him, wrapped in a sodden shawl. Still, there was no space for fear. He motioned for Devika to bring neem leaves and fresh water. If the disease spread as swiftly as Mahadeva claimed, they would need to prepare. If the disease spread as swiftly as Mahadeva claimed, they would need to prepare. While Devika boiled the neem water, Raghava moved among the other patients, checking pulses and temperatures. He felt a growing certainty that the epidemic had entered a new stage. In the afternoon, he met with Pranav in the storeroom. The young man's face was pinched with worry. "If this fever has reached the hills," Pranav began, "will it not come here in greater numbers?" "It already has," Raghava replied. "We must be ready. Tonight you will prepare additional decoctions, and tomorrow you must ride to the next village for more herbs." Pranav bowed without protest. In this work, there was no room to hesitate. That evening, when the rain eased to a damp hush, Raghava sat beside Mahadeva again. The man's breathing was slower now, though his forehead remained hot. "You will stay here as long as you need," Raghava said softly. "You are not alone." Mahadeva closed his eyes. A tear slid down his temple into the folds of the blanket. Raghava reached for a cloth to wipe it away. In that moment, he felt the burden of all the stories carried to his courtyard, each one a testament to both the fragility and resilience of life. The lamps were lit as dusk fell, casting warm halos across the damp walls. Patients shifted beneath their coverings, and the courtyard grew quiet. Before retiring, Raghava dipped a cloth into the perfumed protective oil, brushing it lightly over Mahadeva's chest. The scent of sandalwood rose into the night air, mingling with the faint, metallic smell of rain-soaked earth. In the ledger, he made a final note: patient resting. Fever unchanged. Monitor closely. When he closed the palm leaf pages, the sense of gravity remained. Yet so did a quiet resolve. Each day brought new uncertainty, but here, within the walls of the House of Healing, no one would face it unaccompanied. He looked around the courtyard once more, at the dim shapes of sleeping bodies, the flickering lamp flames, the silent neem branches overhead. Then he turned inward, to the stillness that had always guided his hands, and let it steady him for the work yet to come. Chapter 9. The Lantern Procession. The following dawn arrived, pale and unsteady, like a child rising after illness. The rain had retreated for the moment, leaving behind a courtyard glistening with beads of water. The air smelled of wet earth and faint sandalwood from the night's anointing. Raghava woke before the birds began their tentative calls. His first thoughts were of Mahadeva. Crossing the threshold into the sick room, he saw the man still breathing, weakly but with more steadiness than the day before. Quiet relief eased the tightness in his chest. He motioned for Pranav to prepare a thin gruel flavored with cumin and a dash of rock salt to replenish the man's depleted strength. As the morning unfolded, neighbors began arriving with small offerings: bundles of dry wood, baskets of rice, a folded cloth for dressing wounds. Word of Mahadeva's journey had traveled swiftly, and the villagers sensed that the fever from the hills could soon reach them all. Raghava accepted each gift with solemn gratitude. He believed that no healer ever truly worked alone. Every jar of ghee, every length of clean cotton, every hand that swept the floor or brought water, each was a stitch in the fabric of protection. In the late morning, a curious quiet settled over the courtyard. Patients rested beneath their blankets, breaths shallow but calm. Even the neem leaves seemed to hold still in the moist air. That hush was broken by the arrival of a young woman from the southern fields, her hair plaited and dark as river mud. She carried in her arms a brass lantern, its surface etched with looping designs of lotus and deer. "My mother says this should burn through the night," she explained shyly. to guide the spirits that might linger. Raghava inclined his head. Though he did not claim to know what unseen forces might pass between the sick and the well, he had learned never to dismiss the power of symbols. He set the lantern by the neem tree and filled it with clarified butter. When he touched the flame to the wick, it caught at once, a small, steady brightness against the afternoon gloom. All day, the lantern burned. Patients watched it from their mats, some with eyes clouded by fever, others with the clear gaze of those who understood the gravity of what approached. By evening, more villagers had gathered in the courtyard. Though the rain threatened, they lingered, with quiet purpose. Some knelt to whisper prayers. Others simply stood in the shadows, as if their presence alone could bolster the house of healing. As dusk deepened, Raghava spoke to the gathered neighbors. "The fever may come more swiftly now," he said, voice calm. "Each of us has a part to play, whether in gathering herbs, tending the sick, or keeping watch through the night." No one protested or turned away. It was an unspoken agreement. They would stand together against the unseen enemy. That night, as the first drops of fresh rain tapped at the eaves, Raghava and Devika prepared for the vigil. Small earthen lamps were lit and placed along the threshold. Fresh neem leaves were hung from the rafters. The perfumed oil was warmed again, ready to anoint the weakest patients. Mahadeva stirred in his sleep, coughing weakly. Raghava knelt to support his shoulders, helping him sip a few mouthfuls of the gruel. Each swallow seemed an effort, but he did not resist. At the far end of the courtyard, the lantern's flame glowed through the damp, golden and constant. Late into the night, the neighbors began to move in a quiet procession. One by one, they passed before the lantern, dipping their heads in respect. Some carried handfuls of dried tulsi or sprigs of holy basil. Others brought their own small lamps, adding them to the ring of light that slowly formed beneath the neem tree. Devika, carrying a fresh bundle of sandalwood shavings, paused to watch the procession. "They are not afraid," she whispered. Raghava looked around the courtyard, where lamplight flickered over every face. "Or perhaps they are," he replied softly. "But they will not face this alone." In that moment, he felt the balance shift, not just in the sick room, but in the hearts of everyone gathered. What had begun as quiet dread was transforming into a shared resolve. The hours passed. Rain fell again in sheets, drumming on the tiles and flowing in rivulets across the courtyard floor. Yet inside, the little circle of light held steady. As the night wore on, Raghava moved among the patients, replenishing poultices and checking pulses. Each time he passed the lantern, he felt a brief warmth in his chest, as though the flame contained all their collective strength. Shortly before dawn, the rain eased. The clouds began to thin, and the eastern sky hinted at a paler hue. Raghava sat for a moment beneath the neem branches, listening to the breaths of the sick, the faint crackle of the lantern, and the quiet rustle of neighbors settling to rest. In the ledger, he recorded a single line. The village came to stand vigil. The flame did not fail. And in that simple record, he knew, was proof that no healer's work began or ended alone. Chapter 10. The Journey for Bitter Roots. By the 10th day, the fever had reached 3 more households along the riverbank. Raghava noted the signs with an experienced eye. The sluggish pulse, dry tongue, and flickering heat behind the eyes. Though no panic had spread, he knew the turning point was near. Their stores of medicine, though lovingly maintained, were now stretched thin. The clay pot of dried powder sat nearly empty. The perfumed oil was reduced to a film clinging to the bottom of its vessel. And so, it was time for the most essential journey. He summoned Pranav after the midday meal. "You must go to the hill forests," he said simply. "We are nearly out of Kiratatikta and Guduchi. If the next wave is stronger, we will not be ready." Pranav, though still youthful in his bones, did not hesitate. He had been trained for this, to walk long miles with a steady step, to recognize bark by its scent and roots by the shape of their shadows. The herbs he was sent to gather were not ordinary. Kiratatikta, the bitter green stems prized for breaking relentless fevers, and Gudushi, the climbing vine said to carry the vitality of the moon itself. Raghava prepared a satchel with care, cotton cloths for wrapping roots, a copper flask of warm ghee and rice, and a pouch of dried tulsi for his protection. Before Pranav departed, Devika tied a length of red thread around his wrist and whispered a blessing into his ear. Words passed down from her grandmother, healer to healer, like a low chant shared in the dark. The sun was already leaning westward when Pranav stepped onto the forest path. The air there was different, resinous with pine, humming with bees, the occasional shimmer of monkeys leaping between the branches overhead. It was said that these woods remembered every step and could tell friend from stranger. Though he moved with focus, Pranav let himself breathe the rhythm of the trees. The fever weighed on him, its scent, its fatigue, its persistence. But the forest gave balance. He stopped to press his palm against the bark of a neem tree, murmuring thanks. Then he climbed toward the shaded terraces where the vines of Guduchi were known to grow. Meanwhile, in the house of healing, Raghava and Devika worked without pause. Mahadeva had grown restless in his sleep, his breathing shallow again. Raghava renewed the poultice on his chest and wiped sweat from his temples. The other patients were quieter but worn thin by the weight of days. Raghava could feel it, how closely their bodies hovered between heat and stillness, as if balancing on the edge of a narrow reed. Late into the evening, Devika came to him with a request. "Let me prepare the ritual of sutkle," she said. "It's what my mother used when fever lingered like a shadow." Raghava nodded. Though not found in the older sutras, the practice had a deep local memory. It involved mixing ash from sacred firewood with wet clay and turmeric, then shaping small tokens, circles, leaves, a lotus. These were placed near the patient's mat, beside the lantern, or tucked gently beneath the pillow. It was believed they drew out what could not be named. As Devika prepared the mixture, the scent of smoke and earth filled the air. She moved silently, shaping the clay with practiced fingers. Beside Mahadeva, she placed a small clay lotus, cool and damp, like a second breath. Back in the forest, Pranav had reached a rocky ledge where Guduchi vines spilled over the slope like dark green rivers. He crouched low, whispering a greeting before cutting a few branches with a bronze knife. Each snip was deliberate. The medicine would only work if taken with care, with reverence. He bundled the vines in cloth, tying them with a strand of dried grass. Next, he continued further, where bitter stems of Kiratatikta grew in the dappled light beneath sal trees. He recognized the telltale clusters, leafless, rigid, intensely green. He harvested only what was needed, then covered the roots with earth again. No part of the forest was taken without giving something back. By the time he began the journey home, the stars had already pierced the canopy. Pranav walked by moonlight, the satchel heavier now, not from weight alone, but from the importance of what it carried. At the house of healing, Raghava sat near Mahadeva once more. The man had opened his eyes, fevered but aware. "You walked far," Mahadeva whispered. "It was you who walked here first," Raghava replied. "Now, another walks for you." He lifted a spoon of thin broth to Mahadeva's lip, a swallow, then another. The man closed his eyes, not in sleep, but in peace. That night the patients slept in quiet rhythms. Devika's clay tokens remained in place, each still damp with hope. And in the courtyard, the lantern by the neem tree burned as steadily as ever. Just before dawn, Pranav returned. His sandals were caked with mud, his shoulders sore, but his face was bright with quiet triumph. He opened the satchel and laid the bundles before Raghava like offerings at an altar. "Guduchi, Kiratatikta," leaves still breathing with life. Raghava placed a hand on Prana's shoulder. "You have brought more than herbs," he said. "You have brought time. Time for the body to recover, time for the fever to break." And time, he knew, was the rarest medicine of all. Chapter 11. The Bitter Draught. With the dawn came a hush that felt almost holy. Even the birds seemed to wait, as if they too understood something momentous had arrived. The courtyard lay damp and quiet. Wisps of mist curled beneath the neem tree and drifted through the threshold, carrying the promise of change. Raghava rose before the first chant of prayer. He moved to the storeroom, where Pranav's bundles of fresh guduchi and kiratatikta waited. The sight of them, their vivid greens, their potent scents, felt like a tide turning. He chose the best stems of kiratikta first. He laid them on a slab of granite, crushing them with a smooth stone until the bitter juice pooled beneath his hands. The smell was sharp, nearly caustic. Some would have recoiled from its pungency, but to Raghava, it was the smell of renewal. He strained the liquid through clean cotton, collecting every drop in a brass vessel. Next, he prepared the guduchi, slicing it into thin discs, simmering it in water with a pinch of dried ginger and long pepper. As the brew darkened, it released a fragrance of earth and fire. He stirred it slowly, careful not to let the decoction boil over. In Ayurveda, medicine prepared in haste lost not only potency, but also virtue. By sunrise, the bitter draught was ready. Devika carried it carefully to the sick room. Mahadeva was propped against folded blankets, his skin still hot, but his breathing more regular. His eyes opened as she approached. "This will be strong," she said softly, "but you must take it." He nodded, though a flicker of dread passed across his face. Even among the villagers, kiratatik was infamous. It scoured the tongue and left a sharp ache behind the eyes. But it was also known to cool the flames that fever kindled. Raghava knelt beside the mat and held the cup to Mahadeva's lips. The man swallowed once, paused, and then forced himself to drink again. Each mouthful seemed to draw the heat outward, though beads of sweat still pooled at his temples. When he finished, his shoulders slumped, as if the effort had emptied him of strength. But when Raghava laid a hand on his pulse, he felt a subtle steadiness, a note of order returning. They did not rush the moment. Devika wiped Mahadeva's brow with a damp cloth, while Raghava murmured a simple mantra of protection. Though science and devotion often walked separate paths, in this place they moved together. All morning, the bitter draught was given in measured sips to the other patients who could tolerate it. Some turned away after a swallow, but most accepted it, trusting in the quiet confidence of their healers. By midday, the courtyard seemed to breathe easier. The fever was not gone. It would never vanish so quickly, but its edge had dulled. The children's coughs grew less harsh. A woman who had spent 3 days unable to sit upright lifted her head and whispered a request for water. Outside, neighbors came and went, bringing more gifts: a basket of lemons to cool the blood, a jar of clarified butter for poultices, a handful of dried neem leaves for the thresholds. Each arrival was greeted with gratitude. For every offering was another thread woven into the fabric of care. In the afternoon, Raghava sat with Pranav beneath the neem tree. For a moment, there was nothing to do but breathe. "You did well," Raghava said. "Those herbs have given us more time." Pranav lowered his gaze. "I feared I would not find enough." "You found precisely what was needed," Raghava replied. "That is all anyone can ask." The younger man closed his eyes, exhaling the tension of days spent in watchfulness and urgency. As the sun dipped westward, Raghava rose to check each patient again. Mahadeva was dozing, though his breaths no longer rasped. A faint flush had returned to his cheeks. Raghava adjusted the blanket around him and allowed himself a moment of quiet hope. By evening, the lanterns were lit one by one. "Chuchukso," Wakabid. The courtyard glowed with a warmth that seemed to push back the shadows. Even the breeze felt gentler, no longer smelling of rain and fear, but of neem and fresh earth. Devika prepared a final round of the bitter draught. She carried the cups with steady hands, her face calm. For each patient she offered a word of reassurance. For each, she waited patiently until the last swallow. When all was done, Raghava closed the brass vessel and placed it back on its shelf. He sat by the doorway, ledger in his lap, and recorded the day in a careful hand. Karatatika administered, fevers easing, strength returning. It was a small note, but it felt monumental. Long after the lamps were extinguished, Raghava remained awake. He listened to the night sounds. The whisper of the neem leaves, the rhythmic breathing from the sick room, the soft sighs of those who kept vigil in their sleep. He thought of the bitter draught, how its taste was harsh, yet its purpose was mercy. He thought of the forest paths Pranav had walked, the threads Devika had tied around each wrist, the quiet resilience of Mahadeva swallowing what he feared. And he understood, as he always did, that healing was never only about herbs or chants or the steady pulse beneath his fingers. It was about the courage to endure the bitterness, trusting that it would carry one safely to the other side. When he finally lay down, he felt the strain in his body, but also a deep, luminous calm. The night held no promise of ease, but it no longer carried dread. Within the walls of this humble courtyard, hope had taken root again. Chapter 12. The Return of Strength. Dawn came quietly, soft as breath on the skin. The first rays fell across the courtyard, touching the empty cups of bitter draught left by the door. Raghava rose before the others, feeling the ache in his limbs from long days without true rest. Yet in that weariness was something steady, like a hidden ember of reassurance that refused to die. He moved first to Mahadeva's mat. The man lay curled on his side, blanketed to the chin, but when Raghava knelt close, he saw his eyes were open, clearer, present. "Are you thirsty?" he asked. Mahadeva nodded, voice still little more than a whisper. Thirsty and hungry. Those simple words carried more weight than any prayer. Devika appeared at the threshold and, seeing Mahadeva awake, covered her mouth to hide a quiet gasp of relief. She slipped away to prepare a thin porridge sweetened with date pulp. It would be the first meal Mahadeva had taken in days. As the sun climbed, other patients stirred. The fever had not disappeared entirely. It clung to them like the last chill of winter. But it had softened, losing its power to overwhelm. Raghava moved among them, checking pulses, adjusting blankets, offering sips of ginger water. When he returned to Mahadeva, the man had managed to sit upright, leaning heavily against folded mats. He accepted the porridge slowly, spoon by spoon, until his strength waned and he lay back, breathing with quiet effort. "You have turned a corner," Raghava said, voice low. "Your body remembers how to heal." Mahadeva's lips curved in the barest suggestion of a smile. He closed his eyes, as though the simple act of being nourished was a luxury he could not yet believe. Outside the sick room, Pranav prepared to ride again. Though the herbs he had gathered were plentiful, other supplies were dwindling. Clean cotton cloths, sesame oil, dried tulsi. There was no promise the fever would not surge once more. Before he departed, Raghava pressed a small clay token into his palm, a circle etched with a lotus. "Carry this," he said. "Let it remind you why we labor." Pranav bowed, tucking the token safely into his satchel. As he led the small horse from the stable, Devika stood by the gate, her hands clasped. She watched until he disappeared down the path, the morning mist swallowing his silhouette. The hours passed with the measured slowness of recovery. Raghava steeped new decoctions of neem and ginger. Devika bathed the weakest patients with warm cloths. From time to time, neighbors arrived to check on their loved ones, their eyes full of cautious hope. In the afternoon, A woman named Kamala, one of the first who had fallen ill, sat up fully for the first time in a week. Her daughter ran to her side, clasping her hand as if she feared it would vanish again. Raghava did not interrupt the reunion. He simply watched, allowing the moment to speak for itself. Later, Devika joined him beneath the neem tree. The lantern from the night vigil had burned low, a stub of wax clinging to the dish. She knelt to clean the soot and refill the vessel. "They are mending," she said, voice hushed. "Truly." "They are," he agreed, "but we will not ease our guard." She nodded, understanding. In their work, no victory was final. Each dawn brought the chance of relapse, but there was no denying the shift in the courtyard's atmosphere, the slow unfurling of relief, like a blossom opening at last to the sun. As evening approached, the air grew fragrant with sandalwood smoke. A neighbor had come to burn a small offering at the threshold, a prayer of thanks and a plea for continued protection. Raghava allowed it gladly. Even rituals he did not claim to fully understand could weave peace into the bones of this place. By twilight, Mahadeva had eaten a second small meal and drank water without assistance. Raghava found him resting against his folded blankets, eyes reflecting the flickering lamplight. "Tomorrow," Raghava said, "we will prepare a tonic to rebuild your strength." Mahadeva managed a soft nod. His hand lifted, searching for Raghava's. For an instant, their fingers touched. One healer, one patient. Joined by something older than words. Devika brought fresh clothes and replaced the poultice on Mahadeva's chest, with a thinner compress soaked in neem water. As she worked, she spoke in a low, comforting voice about the first rains that would soon sweep the hills, how the fields would green and the fever would finally lose its hold. The other patients listened from their mats. Even in exhaustion, their faces softened at her words. When night fell, the lamps were lit once more. Raghava moved slowly from mat to mat, ensuring no one was overlooked. Each patient received a sip of warm ginger infusion, a clean cloth, a moment of quiet reassurance. She was not long in reaping the benefits when she received a sip of warm ginger infusion. A moment of quiet reassurance. A moment of quiet reassurance. As she went, patient was also thinking, no matter what, patient was always the key. Her mind feeling clearer each time the tempo of her thoughts dipped. As he ended by the neem tree, where the lantern now glowed steady again. For a long time, he stood in its light, listening to the rustling leaves overhead, the low sighs of sleeping patients, the heart-deep hush that only arrived when hope returned. At last, he turned to Devika. "Tonight, we rest as much as we can. Tomorrow, we begin again." And in that simple promise, there was more certainty than any vow. A trader in Genoa would send notice to a partner in Barcelona, enclosing a little sachet of lavender to reassure the recipient that the paper had been cleansed. Some letters arrived perfumed with vinegar, their ink smudged where the parchment had been dampened. Others bore wax seals pressed over crushed rosemary. These precautions sprang from a common fear, that contagion might cling to cloth or parchment. The very words, it was said, could be carriers of death. So, it became the habit of cautious correspondents to cleanse their letters as thoroughly as they cleansed their homes. One Florentine merchant left a record of this practice. "When I write to my brother in Avignon, I first set the paper in a box with burning juniper. I let the smoke rise about it until the ink is nearly blurred. Thus, I trust no harm will pass between us." Among the nobility, perfumed letters became both a precaution and a sign of refinement. Courtiers at the French court exchanged folded notes scented with rose or marjoram. They wore gloves when breaking the seals and waved the paper before their faces, hoping that any foul vapor would disperse. Some letters were purely practical, lists of goods ordered, instructions for quarantine, pleas for supplies. Others carried more personal messages, condolences for the dead, assurances of prayers, quiet declarations of love penned in a time when every word might be the last. Even monasteries adopted the practice. Monks in Burgundy sealed their correspondence with wafers pressed in dried thyme. Each parcel bore the same inscription, Sanitas per herbas, health through herbs. Yet not all agreed on the wisdom of these measures. Health share, health herbas, 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 health herbas. Senators Moonbath, Perrin, Haggett, 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 Haggett. Certain scholars argued that perfume was no true protection. They advised that letters be quarantined for weeks before opening. Others insisted that the scents were at least a comfort, a way to steady the mind when news arrived. In a merchant's ledger from Venice, an entry survives, paid to the perfumer for sachets to accompany letters, 6 soldi. It is a small notation, easily overlooked, yet it speaks volumes about how daily life had changed. Even ink and parchment had become suspect. Sometimes the letters themselves recorded the recipes. A physician traveling through Lombardy described how villagers fulminated their missives. They take a brazier of coals, upon which they cast rosemary and wormwood. Over this they hold the letter, so the smoke passes through it. They say this purifies the words. For the people who received such letters, the ritual of opening them took on a strange formality. A cloth steeped in vinegar might be laid across the parchment. Windows were thrown open. Only then would the seal be broken. Among the most poignant were the letters sent by families separated by quarantine. Parents wrote to children kept in other towns, their words full of longing. Husbands wrote to wives confined behind city walls. Often, the letters ended with the same plea. Keep the herbs near you, and think of me. Some letters never arrived at all. Couriers fell ill, or border guards refused passage. The roads themselves became dangerous as fear and suspicion grew. Yet still, the attempt was made. For to stop writing would have been to abandon the slender ties that held communities together. In time, fragrant letters became so common that perfumers began offering special kits, small boxes containing sachets, sealing wax, and powdered herbs, each promised to guard the sender's words against corruption. The practice endured even after the worst years passed. Long afterward, when plague had loosened its grip, merchants and nobles continued to scent their correspondence. It had become habit, a gesture both practical and symbolic. Historians today examine these letters with care. Some are faded almost to illegibility, but traces of the herbs remain, a smudge of lavender here, a faint tang of vinegar there. And to read them is to step into a world where words were freighted with peril and fragrance became a fragile shield. One letter, preserved in an abbey archive, ends with a note written in a hurried hand. I beg you, do not fear this letter. I have smoked it thrice with rosemary and sealed it with my prayers. It is a reminder that in times of plague, communication itself was an act of faith. The sender believed that words, carried across distance, could bind hearts more strongly than disease could sever them. Even the smallest gestures, sprinkling herbs, waving scented smoke, became symbols of resilience. And in this way, each perfumed letter was more than a message. It was proof that hope, like fragrance, could travel farther than anyone imagined. Chapter 14. The Ritual of Renewal. Mahadeva slept deeply, his breathing even and unlabored. Kamala, already awake, sat cross-legged on her mat, combing her daughter's hair with slow, deliberate strokes. A week ago, she had not had the strength to lift her head. "Will we have the ritual today?" she asked softly, as Raghava checked her pulse. "Yes," he said. Today, we will mark the turning. The ritual of renewal was not written in any sutra or treatise. It had grown out of the lived knowledge of the healers who came before him, an understanding that illness did not simply leave the body behind. It left its shadow, a residue of fear that could linger in the spirit. To clear it away, one needed more than medicine. After the morning meal, a simple fare of soft rice and buttermilk, Raghava and Devika began preparing the space. They swept the courtyard clean, sprinkled water scented with tulsi along the thresholds, and arranged clay lamps in a circle around the neem tree. Each lamp was filled with clarified butter and a strand of cotton wick. Next came the garlands, fresh jasmine and marigold blossoms strung together in long chains. Devika hung them across the doorway, letting their fragrance sweeten the air. The children of the neighborhood came to watch, their eyes wide, sensing that this was a day apart from the ordinary. As the sun climbed, neighbors arrived carrying small offerings, a bowl of yogurt, a brass tray of incense, a woven mat to place before the tree. Each gift was received with quiet thanks. By midday, the courtyard had transformed. The shadows of sickness still lingered, but the place no longer felt bound by them. Instead, it felt poised, as if waiting for the final breath of darkness to be exhaled. Raghava moved from mat to mat, explaining the ritual to each patient. "You have survived the fever," he said, "but your bodies and hearts are still tender. Today, we honor that you are alive. We invite strength to return fully." Mahadeva listened with his eyes closed, as though memorizing each word. When he opened them again, they were clear, reflecting the quiet light of resolve. As dusk approached, Devika prepared small bowls of perfumed oil, sandalwood, and rose, infused with a few drops of camphor. The oil would be used to anoint the hands and foreheads of each patient, a gesture of blessing and closure. When the last light of day slipped behind the trees, Raghava lit the lamps one by one. Their flames flickered, bright and unwavering in the evening breeze. He invited the patients to sit, if they were able, or to rest comfortably upon their mats. Mahadeva, with Devika's help, made his slow way to a place just before the neem tree. He sat cross-legged, spine as straight as he could hold it. Raghava lifted the bowl of oil and dipped his fingers within. He approached Mahadeva first, touching a single drop to the center of his forehead. "You have passed through darkness," he intoned. "May light remain with you." Mahadeva closed his eyes, the lines of strain on his face easing. One by one, Raghava moved among them. Kamala, the child with the cough, the young woman whose fever had been most persistent. Each received the same blessing. Each bowed their head. When all had been anointed, Raghava returned to the neem tree and stood in the circle of lamps. For a long moment, no one spoke. The only sounds were the crackle of the wicks and the slow breathing of the gathered patients. Devika stepped forward with a clay vessel of cool water. Raghava dipped his hands within, letting the water sluice away the residue of oil and fever alike. At last he spoke. "This house has seen much struggle. It has seen fear and exhaustion, but it has also seen courage. No healer works alone. You have all kept faith, with your bodies, with each other, with life itself." He paused, letting the silence settle again. In that hush, something lifted, a heaviness that had clung to every corner. It did not disappear, but it softened, releasing its hold. Mahadeva opened his eyes. Though his voice was little more than a whisper, it carried clearly across the courtyard. "Thank you," he said, "for not leaving us." Raghava inclined his head, unable to find words that would fit the enormity of that gratitude. As the ritual ended, Devika distributed small spoonfuls of sweetened milk, a symbol of renewed nourishment. Each patient drank, their hands steady. Even those too weak to rise managed to lift the offering to their lips. When the last lamp burned low, Raghava and Devika moved quietly to extinguish them. One by one, the flames surrendered to darkness, leaving only the lingering warmth of their light. Before he closed the courtyard for the night, Raghava looked once more at the neem tree. Its branches stirred in the evening breeze. He imagined that if he listened closely enough, he would hear it whispering thanks. And so, the 14th day ended, not in triumph, but in the gentle, unshakable assurance that life was returning to its rightful rhythm. And by the 14th day, the rhythm. Chapter 15. The Last Watch of the Season. The morning after the ritual of renewal dawned clear and cool. For the first time in weeks, the courtyard lay utterly still, as if the ground itself had decided it no longer needed to brace against calamity. Sunlight slid over the neem tree, touching the bricks still fragrant with the last embers of sandalwood. Raghava rose and moved quietly through the house. The patients were stirring on their mats, not with the restless discomfort of fever, but with the slow, steady wakening of ordinary life. Mahadeva was already propped against his folded blankets, cradling a clay cup of warm milk. When he looked up, his face carried an expression that was at once weary and bright with relief. "Today," Raghava said softly, "we will begin to speak of going home." Mahadeva lowered his gaze, as though the prospect of returning to his own threshold was too big to look upon all at once. The hours of that day unfolded gently. There was no urgency, no frantic preparation of decoctions or searching for fresh herbs. Instead, there was the quiet ritual of tending to convalescence, checking pulses that no longer raced, bringing thin rice gruel sweetened with jaggery, replacing blankets that smelled of long illness with fresh cotton aired in the sun. Kamala rose unassisted for the first time, her steps unsteady but certain. The young mother whose child had been fevered carried the boy into the courtyard, where he watched the light play across the walls as if he had never seen brightness before. Their quiet laughter drifted to the neem tree, the sound delicate as new leaves. In the afternoon, Devika prepared a final batch of herbal compresses, warm bundles of neem and ginger to soothe the last aches in weary limbs. As she worked, she spoke softly to each patient, telling them how their strength would return day by day. Her voice, steady and kind, carried more healing than any mixture in Raghava's ledgers. By sunset, Raghava gathered the patients beneath the neem tree. They sat together, Mahadeva, Kamala, the young mother, Kani, Marapio, Digaya, Shavayano, Masad, Arashia, and Fiora Patutska, the older woman who had once believed she would not live to see the rains. Though none were yet fully strong, each carried a spark of resilience no illness could extinguish. Raghava held a brass bowl of warm water and a clean cloth. One by one, he washed their hands. This final cleansing was not merely for the body, but for the spirit, a mark that their time within these walls had reached its close. When it was Mahadeva's turn, he extended his hands without hesitation. Raghava poured the water slowly, feeling the old man's knotted palms grow lighter beneath his touch. "Tomorrow," Raghava said, "you will walk beyond this threshold." Mahadeva's eyes shone, though he did not speak. Some gratitude was too deep for words. After the washing, Devika brought a small tray of offerings, handfuls of sesame sweets wrapped in leaves. She placed one in each pair of hands, a simple gift to mark the transition from patient to survivor. Twilight descended with a hush so profound it felt sacred. The courtyard glowed with the soft gleam of oil lamps. The neem branches overhead stirred in a breeze scented with coming rain. Pranav returned from his journey late that evening. Though his face was lined with fatigue, his eyes grew bright when he saw the courtyard transformed. He moved among the convalescents, bowing slightly to each, as though acknowledging their long battle and the victory hard won. After the patients had settled into sleep, Raghava remained beneath the neem tree. He felt the rough bark beneath his palms and closed his eyes. In that quiet, he let the memories of the past weeks rise, the fever that had burned with merciless hunger, the nights when he feared no dawn would bring relief, the bitter draughts and whispered prayers. And he remembered, too, the moment when Mahadeva first stood unaided, the day Kamala smiled for the first time in days, the soft chorus of voices that had returned to the house like a dawn chorus after a long monsoon. Devika joined him and rested her hand lightly on his arm. Neither spoke. The silence did not need filling. Before they turned in, Raghava gathered the last of the supplies: the crushed neem leaves, the wrapped bundles of dried tulsi, the ledgers thick with notations of fevers measured and pulses counted. He set everything in its place, then paused one last time at the doorway. The lamps flickered low, casting soft pools of light across the mats where the patients, no longer patients, slept. He listened to their breathing, steady and sure, and felt a quiet that was neither exhaustion nor triumph. It was something simpler: the knowledge that this house had given what it could. He stepped into the courtyard and looked up. The stars were gathering beyond the edge of the thatch. In their silent constellations, he thought he glimpsed a reflection of all that had been endured and overcome. When dawn came again, it would be a new season, the season of mending, of rebuilding, of returning to the ordinary. The work would not end, healing never truly did. But for this night, there was nothing more to be asked. Raghava bowed his head to the neem tree, to the empty cups, to the footprints left by all who had passed through the threshold. He whispered a simple farewell to the fever that had tested them, that he had spent so many years fearing the very things that had tested them, and to the strength that had sustained them. Then he turned away, stepping softly into the last watch of the season.